Okay.
Great, wonderful. Here we are on the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont's Education Finance Subcommittee. It's November 18th. It's 10 a.m. We're getting started a couple of minutes late. Apologies to anyone who is waiting for us. Our agenda today is very straightforward. We're gonna approve the meeting minutes, hear from the public, and then spend the entire meeting discussing this policy matrix that we have. And then we will talk about our next meeting and adjourn. So we're just going in deep, ideally.
Sounds good.
Yes. So there's this roll call on the agenda. I think everyone's here except for the interim secretary of education. Zoe is not available to be here with us, but her deputy is here if we have questions specifically for the Agency of Education. And Craig Bolio is walking in the door, so he is now in attendance. Perfect timing. Present and accounted for. There's a lot of.
Poor guard had to. I hope.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So the minutes, shall we approve them? Any clarifications? Okay. Thank you. All those in favor of approving the minutes?
Yes.
Aye.
Wonderful. Anyone against the minutes? Great. Okay. Sorry, it seems excessively formal. Is there anyone from the public who would like to be heard who is here virtually? Please raise your hand if so. Seeing no hands. Is there anyone from the public who is here in person? No. Okay. And I know that the full commission is taking significant public testimony as well as having specifically public hearings. So I think that makes sense. And since everyone but me is in those meetings and I am following them, we are all getting all of that feedback. Wonderful. Okay, we have made up for lost time. Fantastic. Let us discuss this policy matrix. So what I did, not as well as I hoped to, but it's perfectly fine, is I took everyone's answers to the policy matrix and I pasted them into one big policy matrix, sort of row by row. And so we will have, with the first item of an idea to reduce spending or reduce a cost driver, we have sort of a number of solutions to each. Not everyone was able to submit their matrices, and not everyone answered every question. So some items have lots of information in them and some items don't, and that is fine. But I'm hoping that essentially we can go through topic by topic and just discuss each one in depth with the information that we already have with us. Questions, ideas, how to do that better than I've described? Okay, I think we should probably project the thing. Are you able to do that? Just a minute. Thank you.
I could not get mine into edit.
Okay, that's
I was
fine.
at the point of throwing the computer.
That's
so
how I felt last
stopped.
night about my copying and pasting project. So I'm glad that no one's computers have been thrown. You can look at the screen, or maybe Michael would share his computer with
That's
you.
fine. I can
Sure.
look this-
Greg, you're welcome to share.
Isn't it going to be on the?
It'll be
15th?
on the screen too.
Okay. It's very dark from this viewing angle.
You know, it's because I have a privacy screen,
Well, it's difficult.
but I
to
would
share that.
lift it if you wanted to look. Okay, so let's go up to this top row, which is the first section of ideas to reduce cost, is on the topic of tuition. And it's requiring schools to designate up to 3 public schools if they close a school to limit the expansion of tuition vouchers. So these first 2 columns around earliest effective date and date to curb costs was really, I think you all talked at the commission and at the steering committee, right, about how like we're not going to be able to do just one of these things. We're going to need to do a bunch of these things. And so at some point, they're going to need to all be put in a great big strategic plan or a great big bill or something like that. And so being able to see when each lever is pulled and when that lever makes a difference seems like a useful piece of that puzzle. And I know some people were sort of more excited about diving into that piece, but so what I see here is the earliest effective date is April 2025. Someone else put upon passage, which I think is sort of the equivalent of April 2025. I don't think there's some tiny universes where something is passed before that date, but it's fairly rare. Okay. The date to curb costs on this. We have some question marks and some unclear. Does anyone want to build that out at all? Why that's might be unclear?
Because I think it keys off of whether a school district closes a school. Right?
Yeah.
So we don't know when that's going to happen. But I think if you also look at the sort of the policy goals, and I'll just speak for myself, if one, potential objective of school closure is to realize more scale, and you're a district that only operates one school and it results in tuitioning beyond, then you really don't achieve that economy of scale. So to me, it's sort of linked to other actions. It's not in and of itself a cost saver, but it helps to advance the goal of economies of scale by keeping public school students within the public school system.
So the goal is really to stop tuitioning out to private prep school kinds of.
Well, I mean, I think if the purpose of closing a school is to have a bigger school serving more students and therefore realizing economies of scale, then having students go to 6, 7 other schools, whether they be public or private, sort of defeats that purpose.
To concentrate the students as close as possible, especially in an era where our enrollment's declining because of lower birth rate, other factors.
Okay. And would that closing school, right now, if you tuition all your students out, you still have a school board, right?
Right.
Would that school have its own school board to continue?
Ooh, that's a good question, but let's save that for when we get to school consolidation.
Yeah.
So someone here, so we've talked about the policy goal, the fiscal scale is likely quite low. And so the difference between sort of fiscal impact and fiscal scale to me in terms of these 2 questions is one is about sort of like a full number, and one is about how does this number fit into the great big number of the education fund. So one's sort of a absolute number and one's a percentage in that way. Or we could set it as low, medium, high. But I think it's, in the case of this, for me, it's useful in that it might actually be a very tiny fiscal impact we're talking about, especially in the short term. But it's sort of in the contingencies, dependencies, and the policy goal. The idea is that this prevents sort of other perverse incentives that might be created from a policy that's further down this list.
Especially you delay the impact, because I think you get a lot more pushback if you say, and as of June 25, all those kids that have been being tuitioned out to other schools have to come back to those 3. that, especially if you're talking a high school senior.
I
You're
don't think anyone wants to do that.
So I hear
that
you
would
saying,
delay the time of the impact.
well, what I hear you asking, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, please, is whether this is sort of retroactive as well.
Yeah.
Okay,
What, does it apply to all districts that don't operate
yes.
or just districts that prospectively close? And then I think if it applies to all districts, then there's the question of grandfathering.
Yes,
Yes.
I think
Students
it
that
would
are
be,
already- yeah,
yeah,
which
you're
I-
not.
Yeah.
You
But certainly-
diminish the scale for the impact. It's only future. But I think you would have to grandfather kids that are already.
Attending a school
Attending,
under the
yes.
existing, yes, I think that's
I think that's
historically how
fair
that kind
way.
of thing has been
Yeah.
handled.
Okay.
And Elizabeth, you should just jump on in.
Yeah, please don't. Yeah, just because I'm going to be.
We're all looking at a spreadsheet. so
Yes.
I miss you.
Thank you.
So far,
You
I'm
can-
agreeing with everything you're saying, so that's why I haven't spoken.
Okay.
Okay, but you might want to just keep yourself unmuted so you can feel more.
Okay, I'm a little worried
Unless you-
about the noise that might be in my background, so if you
Okay,
start
great.
hearing a lot of background noise, let me know.
Okay, thanks. Other impacts or dynamics that we might want to name about that section. I'm really thinking that if this is sort of cleaned up and added to the interim report, this is in fact a starting point for legislative committees to understand what else they need to understand to understand what questions they still need to ask.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think just to, at the steering group meeting, gosh, when was it, last week? Yeah, we talked about, ideally incorporating some version of this chart into the report,
Mhm.
as opposed to 3 recommendations that we all agree, that the likelihood of that, given the lack of time we've had to do the analysis, it's better to sort of capture the conversation and the issues to consider
Right.
as opposed to, so I think if we can get to a place where this spreadsheet reflects all the good thinking and conversation,
I think
that
it'd
would
be
be a
helpful.
great outcome.
Yes.
The base message is there is no silver bullet.
Right, correct.
It's
That's
gonna
right.
take a lot of levers
Yeah.
to impact.
And understanding the sequencing of the levers,
Yes.
I think is important too.
Yeah.
So are there any other important dynamics or contingencies that need to be named for this policy?
I mean, I think I said in mine, and just in terms of contingencies, it's important to understand that in some communities, there aren't 3 public schools nearby.
Mhm.
And so it would be important to understand that.
We have, at some point it came up, we have a group, I believe up in the kingdom, maybe Victory, that the kids are going to Canada for special ed.
Or New Hampshire, right? And so there have been, I think, I don't know if that is a suggestion here in terms of limiting tuition payments to in-state schools only. Really understanding what impact that has when the
Yes.
public school that students attend is over the river in
Yeah,
New
because
Hampshire.
some of those border towns, the Canadian school is 10 minutes away and the nearest American school is 45 minutes
Mhm.
away.
Yes.
Mhm. Which is different from going to Switzerland.
Yes. We also, I believe,
Go to Switzerland.
I believe we also have one cross-state school district that has federal law attached to it somehow.
Sure does.
Yes.
Take an act of Congress to.
So wild. Okay, anything else on this one before we go to what guiding principles, equity, quality, sustainability, affordability does this touch on?
Emily, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, did you send this via email to us by any chance, or could you, so that I can pull it up on my larger screen? I'm having a little difficulty seeing it on here very well.
It is
Yes.
posted on the website.
It's posted on
Is it?
the website, but I can
Okay.
also email it to you if that would be faster.
See if I can find it.
But in answer to your question, I think sustainability and affordability would be the guiding principle that I think would probably be the most, particularly the state sustainability piece.
I think there are concerns about, you know, admissions requirements in some private schools that are eligible for public dollars. So on the equity piece, just if a school closes and not all kids in that community can all go to the same school because they're not a good fit, that is a consideration as well.
Mhm.
The
Or they
ability-
have a disability.
Right,
Or the ability to get transportation.
right.
So I hear all three. This hits on all three? Yeah, okay.
For sure, the equity and the sustainability and affordability, and I think the quality is
Yes.
a little bit of unknown since
Okay.
state doesn't monitor for quality as much as maybe we're headed to, but
Certainly as much as some other states do.
yes.
Yes,
Correct.
okay. Elizabeth, do you have it?
Yes, I found it. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Sorry about that.
That's okay, no problem.
Also apologies for the terrible formatting. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to limiting tuition payments to average announced tuition.
So the default in statute is average announced tuition for independent schools, but there are some exceptions in statute. So if you're an independent school that operates a tech center, or if your community authorizes a higher amount, which happens, I think, pretty regularly. So I believe I was footnoted in a memo from the independent schools on a misstatement I made on this topic, that public schools have to adhere to average announced tuition. The average announced tuition is the average announced tuition. The district is able to announce their own tuition, but then they have to go through a true-up process where the agency reviews, did you in fact charge for the things that you were charged for? And if you didn't, then you have to, that all gets trued up. So there are different processes in place for public and independent schools at
And
the
in-
moment.
Both cases, there are multiple schools in the system that are charging more than average announced tuition,
Correct.
and districts paying for way more than average announced tuition. And I hear challenges about that from both districts that are paying public and private.
There is a process on the public side for the
Mhm.
agency to review to make sure that what's being charged is appropriate and
Yes.
is
Public school
allowable.
can't pay more than the formula shows.
And on the
Right,
independent
and-
schools, if
And
if
there's
the
no
formula-
really, and there's no real incentive for school districts to, quote unquote, overcharge in that early stage of announcing their tuition. Because when that true up happens, it's after they have actually spent their funding. And which means it's in a subsequent fiscal year. So they've already probably done their audit, closed their books. There's no incentive for them to want to
Kids are
have to
already
pay back
there.
money to other districts. But
Once you have kids in a school, it's really hard to say, we're not going to fund that school.
Mhm.
It's very especially, that's
Mhm.
just very disruptive.
And there are, I know in this last year, in the current budget environment folks were operating in, there was a lot of negotiation that happened around what that tuition would be
Mhm.
in both public and private school settings. And so it's not, so I think there are questions there. So what I hear from folks, and I'm not sure I see this in the writing, is that how it's, maybe I do, actually, sorry. So right here, it says average announced tuition is a function of what public schools charge. Will likely need to create a new statutory construct, allowable tuition or something. But that the concept and the way it's decided probably likely also needs to shift. It's not just who it applies to that needs to shift. Is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, I think the concept is if public schools are subject to oversight on the tuition that they are able to charge, and limits on that, that same oversight and sort of downward pressure should apply to both types of institution.
And I guess
So
what
maybe
I would-
maybe it's more like not average announced tuition and limiting it to that, but limiting it in such a way that it has the same process of rate setting as the public schools.
Because I think I agreed, and I don't even know if the rate setting that public schools go through is necessarily the appropriate rate setting. It might be a new rate setting process. But I think we have a bunch of places in statute where we sort of default to the average as the cost controller, and that is a fairly inflationary cost controller, right? Because it's not based on any necessary, it's sort of like a crowdsourced vision of need rather than a detailed vision of need.
Well, Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I only did this a couple years as business manager, but it's a function of how much it costs to provide on the public side. It's a function of what is it, what are our costs that we can demonstrate are our costs. And so, yes, to your point, there's no downward pressure on this is our, that to me is a different lever in
Yes.
terms of downward pressure on costs. But there are, it's not a made up number, I guess is what I would say, because you have to justify it. It is not something that's disconnected from your actual cost structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very black and white calculation based on expenditures in your budget.
Right. Sure.
Not based on the prestige of your school.
Or what you're able to persuade voters you need. You do that in a different way, but yeah.
So I have heard a rumor, and this is like straight up rumor that I'm speaking out loud in order to have someone correct me. Just want to be clear about that. That there are public schools that are charging more in average tuition to other districts outside their own than they are covering, than they need to cover their own costs of their own students in their own district. Anyone else heard about that before? For the business manager types, does that even sound possible to you?
I think in absence of having the same kind of process, I don't know how we would know that, whether they're charging
Right.
more,
Okay.
right? Like, how would we get any kind of reporting that would indicate that they were charging more than what they need?
Yeah, I mean, are they offering different types of service? I mean, there are some districts that offer tuition or not tuition, offer transportation. There becomes a sort of effort to attract as many tuition paying students as you can. And so you run buses up. I'm speaking from my neck of the woods. You run buses up to the islands that have Wi-Fi on them, and you can attract more students because that's convenient for parents, or you have after school, and so I think.
Yes. Well, my school district, we sent a bus to Granville
Right.
because they don't have an operating school.
Right, and that is more expensive than it costs to pick up kids within your own district.
Yeah.
So that, again, to Elizabeth's point, because it's a bit of a, it's not clear. It's the agency oversees it, but it's not necessarily something other districts have access to knowing.
Okay.
But I'd say it depends on what lengths districts are going to in order to get those tuition students
Yes.
there.
Any other impacts or dynamics or contingencies and dependencies that need to be named about this topic? I think the retroactive issue, again, like what effective dates would look like, setting them. I think in all of this work, like putting in a control too fast, too extreme can cause schools and districts to crash essentially, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not something that can be done for FY 26 because there's some work to be done to identify what should the process look like, and then folks need time to build a budget around that. What implications that would have.
And how much notification you need to give
Right.
families and.
Right.
So FY 27
Yes.
for when dates might start for, okay. Everyone agree with that?
You think earliest date of a bill could pass is April, and the
Unless
next
we
fiscal year
find-
starts July 1. I
Yeah.
don't know how you
Yeah.
do it sooner than that.
If we found a silver bullet.
I keep looking.
I don't think we should equate our school system to vampires.
Thank you.
I've used the phrase silver bullet like 15,000 times in this topic. I just sort of all of a sudden realized.
Yeah.
Okay. What?
There's a lot of them flying
There are a lot of
around.
them flying around. Guiding principles that this applies to.
Sustainability and affordability, making sure everyone's playing by the same rules and they're transparent.
I think
Equity.
similar ones to the last.
Gonna move on to the next one. I feel like we're going very fast here. For someone to figure out how to actually do this well, what would they need to know?
For limiting.
For limiting tuition payment, yeah. I want to add a little more detail.
You'd have to know all the schools that do it. You'd have to know where students actually go. You'd have to know what tuitions are actually paid and what the options are for 3 public schools in the area. If the private school is 10 miles away and the public school is 20, we have a problem.
What problem do we
Yeah, I
have?
think that was mentioned on here where it says need to keep in mind areas of the state where public schools are more sparse and not as available. So kind of
Okay.
balancing that.
But I think, the central tension is public school budgets are open for inspection and reporting requirements to the Agency of Education, where things that are getting charged are getting reviewed. And I don't believe the same is true for the independent school. So it's difficult to know, without having some sense of those budgets, what's doable, what's not doable.
Consider a set form of what's in statute that has to be submitted to the Agency of Education.
Which we have to do.
Right.
But they have all the detailed data in our stat book, right? So
Right.
it's not just we submit a form and we attest to it. It's that they can then, I've
Verify.
had error messages come back. They're like, wait a minute, you said this, but your numbers say this.
Oh.
Explain.
That's great, actually,
Yeah.
to know. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else on this one?
And Elizabeth, do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely. Perfect. Yep. True.
That's what my finance director described to me too.
Okay, establishing optimal school sizes. So we're on the school size section. It includes establishing optimal school sizes, merging small schools and districts, and then essentially sort of classroom size ratios stuff. So sort of 3 different pieces of the same whole, all economies of scale. So in the policy goals here, which I'm going to jump to and then go back, we have realizing economies of scale within public schools in order to bring down costs, cost containment, to help districts determine when mergers are necessary versus it being an individual decision. Anyone want to elaborate on that? Because that's one that I've had a lot of private conversations about, but I haven't heard a lot of public conversation about.
Are we at the established optimal school size?
Yes, yeah.
And the one that says to help districts determine, which I did not.
But then you've got to give them viable options.
But even just that sort of, that districts, there might be value in not having districts do this on their own decision making. So what I've heard people say about this, superintendents and school board chairs to me, is that the political will and sort of the intimacy of a local decision around this is too much to navigate in the face of, just how personal it all is. And a state mandate would depersonalize it in a way that because problems would be more easily solved.
Well, I even heard testimony from superintendents from Madison County, I think before House Ways and Means about this topic, where there were some who believed that they could, but the wills of their community were different and countered what their advice was to their boards. So I've heard some conversation even publicly about that topic.
There's been a lot of conversations in Washington County, and I don't know if you
Yes,
want to
there
reflect
have.
on those. but-
I think, and I went to some of the public meetings, that closing your school is a major change. It's going to be a major change for your children. There seems to be a real fear that if you don't have a school in your town, it is kind of a gathering point. It's the one big building you can meet in. But there's a fear that if you don't have a school there, no one will move there, which nationally, I don't think most people are used to having a school in. But the other big issue is just closing the school doesn't save the money. You've got to have a place where they can go. I've got another district that has 4 or 5 elementary schools, probably within 10 miles. But no one of those schools can take all those kids. So the state is going to have to come up with some way to either build something new or probably enlarge something existing so that there is a nice space with a nice school whose roof isn't leaking, which seems to be a perpetual problem, that those kids can go to. And I think that falls on the state to talk about school construction money, which I have yet to be told where it is.
Well, that's further down on the list. Further down on the list.
But I think I don't think we can ask local school boards to do it because you just alienate too many of your friends and neighbors. And having been through that experience with civil unions and lost friends for months or years and sometimes forever, that's a very painful thing to go through. And without, the Supreme Court kind of push behind you, no one is going to choose to go through. So we're going to have to do that. There's talk probably on here somewhere about minimum class size. Well,
Let's wait to get to that.
okay, but I mean, what we need to do is say, what do you do if you don't have enough kids to meet that? Do you have to send them somewhere else? How many grades can you merge? Can you merge 6 grades? When does that be? So we're going to have to get a structure that school boards can say, but the state won't let us do that, or they say we have to.
Right. So what I think because we're operating in a little bit of a crisis environment fiscally, we have a tendency right now to lose track of the quality improvements that would occur from having more kids in a school, and sort of the opportunities that would be offered there. And on the opposite side, the other sort of opportunity in it is, and Ben Doyle from the Preservation Trust has a great op-ed about this from like 5 years ago in Digger that I like can't find, but about the idea that like having your whole community rest on a few third graders is a lot of pressure on those third graders, right?
Yes.
And what would it take to help a community see the vision for another community building that has way more opportunities for more people other than those elementary school kids in it? And I think historically, the state and districts have actually really not done that great a job on that side of the puzzle. So in my corner of the world, Wilmington, a long time ago, consolidated 2 high schools, had an empty high school building downtown in Wilmington, which is like a fairly thriving downtown compared to lots of places. But it took, I think, almost a decade to adapt that building because the future use was not included in the conversation around the closure. And so it closed, and then the future use conversation came in, and then the visioning happened, and then the funding came, and then the management happened. And so it's a lot to do at once, but I'm just curious about the opportunities that occur when we're able to offer to a community something new to say yes to, rather than just something to say no to.
And Vermont has done that in the past.
Mhm.
You know, I serve a district where in the mid-1990s, Waterbury and Duxbury merged. They closed a small building that was in need of construction or need of significant work, and they built a new school in order to merge the 2 school districts. So I think it's possible if we have a vision for that and some guidelines. You know, it's one of the nice things to be able to talk about the Pikus report in discussion with school construction. So what are the ways that we can achieve scale, and because it does take time.
Yeah. And I think,
Investment.
and I think the more the community conversation gets bogged down in should we or shouldn't we, in the absence of any parameters from the state around this is the ideal school size from both a quality and a sustainability standpoint, you can't get to the future because there's this sort of pitched battle for the very existence of a community. It's very emotional. It's very difficult. And so I think some clearer standards and expectations around school size, class size, all this, not just from a savings standpoint, but from a quality standpoint. And then also recognizing, I think, Megan Roy has said this, there are some communities where keeping a school open is a necessity because of the geographic isolation. And then there's other communities where it's a choice. And it's a choice that I think we all pay for, and that also students pay for in terms of potentially limited opportunities or being in a classroom that has 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade all combined together, or being, the only girl in a class,
When we
right?
had
There
There were 3
impacts
girls
on
and 1
students.
boy. That
Yeah.
was the class.
Yeah. And I think it's really hard to get to what's possible if it's this like existential
Yes.
battle.
I think
It-
also there's also, even when we're not talking about either closing a school or a small school or merging or any of those things, sometimes in communities, even trying to kind of establish a certain class size or anything like that, or optimum school size for the class sizes is difficult, even to the scale of if we even try to maybe cut one particular teacher or one particular course of study or something out of our schools to try to, gain some efficiency in our staffing versus student numbers because maybe our enrollment's dropping or whatever, that is unpopular. It's unpopular for the school district to do it without any parameters being set at the state level. And then even further than that, let's say we, had established optimal class sizes. There could be even more creative suggestions like repurposing a particular school that's now a K through 6 into being a pre-K through 2. And then another school, but, clustering the grade levels in buildings to gain that efficiency and staffing so that you're not mixing grade levels. Like there's all kinds of ideas that can come out. But if the idea is coming from the school district individually and that school board, those can become very unpopular out in the community and unlikely to be voted positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for raising that,
Yes.
Elizabeth. Is someone who came from a district where it was 2 positions being reduced, created major conflict.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's not just about school,
It's about personnel.
personnel, the people.
Yeah.
I remember
We're people-centered business,
Yeah.
right? And
we had a proposal to remove a very popular teacher in a class. I remember my daughter in 8th grade was out picketing the school. For this
we had a
teacher.
sit-in.
We had a
students.
school board member resign because her children got so hectored at school over this decision. So it does get really personal and, yeah, really difficult.
And I want to name that, so if the legislature sort of moving on to other impacts and dynamics and contingencies, I think that's what we're doing now.
Mhm.
If we know all of that happens at the local level and then that political pressure is too much to bear at the local level, I think I need to acknowledge that same political pressure will be brought to bear by locals on their legislator if this
Definitely.
is what we're discussing.
Yes.
And so I think there's a real question about what it will take for the legislature to be able to bear that political pressure if all of the organizations represented at the commission think this is the right path to go and if this is sort of the necessary piece of the puzzle. And I think that's a real political question that needs to be resolved.
Maybe more of a pressure in the House where you represent 1 or 2 or 3 of those towns. In the Senate, it's probably broad enough. Plus, right now, the pressure to do something, anything about the property tax is your counterbalance. We've reached the point where doing nothing and just keep paying more is not seen publicly as a viable option. Until you get into that emotional, it's my school.
Right. Well, I didn't mean that.
Yeah,
There's a
Do
lot.
something, but not that.
That's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
real thing.
Yes.
So, okay, so I have
That's why they raise the big bucks.
some other contingencies. So one, the PICUS model provides this insight about what would happen if a whole system is adapted, not if just this one piece is adapted. And specifically, we think we've seen historically that sometimes without other fiscal levers pulled, cost savings are just distributed somewhere else,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So that's one. We talked about geography.
There is at least one school that cannot get out of its hole in the wall valley in less than 20 minutes.
Mhm.
I forget which one it was, but they had all of us convinced that there was no viable way to get their kids out.
Personally, I don't think 20 minutes is.
And it was down in, I think your area was down south.
Okay, any other?
Well, I do think that there is, I don't know that it's reflected here necessarily, but acknowledging student need in some way is important. So when I look at staff to student ratio, and I'm not exactly sure, like, are we doing the whole category? Are we just doing the school size? But whether it's school size or whether it's ratios or class size, I think that the state has weighted the formula to account for the state has bought the premise that some students are more expensive to educate than others. And the reason they're more expensive is because additional staffing. It's not because of, it's people that
Yeah.
those, in the context of Winooski, where we have English language learners, we have both personnel and all personnel, teaching staff and support staff who exist to eliminate barriers to learning, right? That's more expensive. The staffing model is different. So I just want to make sure from an equity perspective that when we think about right sizing our staffing model or our school size, we're also accounting for, and I would assume that that comes from a staff to equalize student ratios or some way to say, yeah, some schools may have more or smaller ratio, and that's intended because, right, they have a higher student need.
And I think the
I don't know if that's
PICUS
the best way to do
study
that, but-
addressed that. And there's way more to do to uncover that.
Yeah.
Um,
I still wonder about our rural kids more expensive to educate than city
Right, and
kids.
so the weights
That
do,
one I'm just not sure about.
well, they account for the lack of, so our existing weights do account for rurality and sparsity, right? And
Yeah.
so unless we're gonna throw out all the weights, I mean, I do think that we have something in existing statute that could help us evaluate need through these weights that
Yes.
exist.
As at least a starting point.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to either other impacts or dynamics or considerations with respect to equity, that we need to be capturing need as part of
Yes.
establishing
Having,
staffing targets.
I think everyone that came to the St. Albans public hearing was a teacher. And I think we need to find something we can say to teachers that if we do this, it will get easier for you.
Most teachers I've talked to think this is a good idea and
Okay.
actually want more kids in their classrooms.
Mhm.
And I don't know if I'm talking to a weird sample of teachers, and I'm sure that many, that the Education Association will share their thoughts on this, but that is something that I have actually
it may
heard from a lot of teachers.
Just be the district, and the makeup of their personnel, but they were saying they are getting just a lot of kids with almost no vocabulary, just kids that are very lacking. And it takes a whole lot more time and that whole socio-emotional kind of component that is there now that is relatively new to teaching. And
Let's save that for the special
Yeah.
education conversation, because I think it's on the edge of that, though it's not entirely that.
But I will say, I think just going back to the political dynamics around these decisions, there is nothing but upward pressure on on the school board. The need is substantial. The supports out in the community do not exist. And so you can make the case, we need more, just add more personnel. And I think there needs to be a conversation around support for districts to employ the best practices. So it's not just more bodies, it's what are people doing in these roles? How are they supported in doing the work that is,
Right.
biggest, impact on students?
And
because I've seen myself, the community has a lot of need. Not always do we have I just think that there need to be conversations around, are we employing the positions that need to be filled to do the work that needs to be done to make the impact that we need to make, and as
And-
opposed to just, if we just have more people in the school, you know what I mean? It's a nuance.
I'm
but I
gonna,
think
I'm
it's
gonna, let's save that, because I think there's a lot around Act 173 that we'll get to that I think is very relevant to that conversation,
Mhm.
as an example of what we're talking about, not
Mhm.
saying it's a replacement for what we're talking about. So let's save that. Are there any other pieces around optimal school size, optimal class size, ratios, and small schools and districts? So one thing that I don't see here around merging small schools and districts is I think people have a lot of questions around sort of what scale of democratic control is appropriate.
I thought it was interesting, the report that just was released by the agency that looked at the number of school board members. in our
Yes.
district. We have a lot of school board members relative to the rest of the country.
Yes.
Per district.
I have 14 in a community with 1,700 students. In my last school district, I had 5,400 students and 9, and 9 was still considered a lot
A
of school
large
board members.
school board, yeah.
But there is, and it gets challenging when I look at the turnover. I was hired 2.5 years ago. And of that board that hired me, of the 14, only 2 remained. So there's also a lot of turnover in some communities, not all communities. But it's hard.
Uncontested races.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's the hardest elected job there is. And I just get between people and their money. School boards get between people, their kids and their money, and it's no win.
Yeah, so I don't really have it, but I don't know if that's what you were sort of getting at, but I do think that we have a tremendous, and it's like one of the commission's principles, acknowledgements that there's this tension between local control and state
Oh, yes.
decision-making, and we've definitely are on this heavily on the side of local decision-making.
And
And
those of us
Yes.
that's been screamed at, you raised my taxes for the last 6 months. It is definitely a pressure point.
yeah,
And that is probably biggest legislative frustration is that every place else, if money is scarce, you don't get to hire, there's vacancy savings. No department in the state, I've been told, is optimally staffed. Some of them detrimentally staffed. And so, yeah, that is an issue.
Okay,
but is that where you were getting?
yes.
Getting at?
Thank you. And I would like to take this moment to shout out to how wonderful I think that recent Agency of Education report was. I was really quite impressed with how clear and straightforward and helpful it was on summarizing some really complex issues.
Someone-
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it was from Friday.
Yeah.
Does anyone remember
I put
what
a lot of this stuff out there.
what was
too.
it called? What was it called, Jill?
I think it's called Vermont Education Funding Explained.
Vermont Education Funding Explained. Great report.
It was excellent.
Okay, guiding principles that these 3 categories address.
And I think if we talk about the need, there's equity, but it's also, I think to Elizabeth's point, when you've got some districts making hard cuts and then other districts not doing that for whatever reason, because everyone gets to decide what they want to do.
I was having a really hard time when Barry was at his 4th vote saying, no matter what you vote, it's really not going to impact your tax rate because everybody else has voted. You're a drop in the budget. And that is a problem. It's a disincentive to take the pressure to make the cost if you're not going to see but that's covered in others.
I also think a youth in a classroom where they might be the only youth in their demographic category or their learning need is not experiencing an equitable education themselves. And so I think that's sort of where the quality and the equity really come together there. So really equity of educational opportunity, I think, could be met through a lot of this. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section here. We are moving so much faster than I thought I would. Very exciting. Okay. Healthcare costs.
We skip it.
Are we trying to tackle these like separately? Because there's like 3 different
I'm gonna
items
do,
under.
yeah, on this one, I'm gonna do, the other one I got a little mixed up with, but we'll do, we're gonna just start with reference-based healthcare costs.
I don't know how we weigh in on that.
Okay.
Like, I have no expertise in that area. I don't
Yeah.
feel like I could or should speak with any credibility about whether that's a good idea or not.
The reference-based piece,
Yeah.
I'm a little bit concerned with whether or not that would bring such pressure on healthcare facilities that it would make it less available. You know, it already seems like it takes you forever to get a doctor's appointment somewhere or a test or a scan or whatever it is you need in our healthcare system. And so I don't know this, but I'm just wondering for anyone who does know anything about reference-based healthcare costs, does that bring pressure on the system in such a way that it would reduce access for those who
Hey,
need it?
Elizabeth, I have a feeling that my paper towel cleanup is gonna make microphone noise and no one's gonna be able to hear what you're saying. So let's just wait 1 second, sorry.
We had an
Okay.
accident here.
Quick.
Good job.
Okay,
Thank you, Mike.
thank you very much. Okay,
Surprise.
back to what you were saying, excuse my tea.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. I don't know much about the reference-based healthcare. And I'm just concerned though, that if that were to be implemented, does that typically bring pressure on the healthcare facilities themselves? You know, is it a situation where many of the smaller places would have to close down, or anything like that, that would cause our healthcare system to have less access to those who need services? It just seems like they're already understaffed and unable to keep up with appointments and those kind of things in the healthcare system that we currently have and the facilities we currently have. And I'm just curious if, you know, you place a reference-based healthcare cost onto them, is that going to make that worse?
And I think that's all a great question for our healthcare committees and the care
Well,
board and the
actually,
hospitals.
having gotten health insurance,
Yes,
as I understand reference-based, is we say, well, we'll only pay, I think it's the Medicare or Medicaid rates, but it's a lower rate than is charged. What happens, unless you cut the cost of providing that service, it gets switched on to other
On the
payers.
other ratepayers.
That's, yeah, when we had a whole lot of people who didn't have health insurance, but our hospitals are required to provide it. All that gets switched on to the private insurance market. So where it sounds good, and having spent the morning getting emails about the announcement that they're closing the psychiatric unit at my local hospital when we've got an emergency room of psychiatric patients, is a little concerning. We have, right now, I'm not sure what's going on, but there's probably going to be some major shakeups or at least some major discussions around the cost of healthcare this year. It's just, we haven't done anything after failing with single payer to speak of, and it's another one that's reached the crisis point.
and so I think we have some expertise in taxes and education in here and have very little expertise in health. So let's, with the exception of you, Anne, and so let's name sort of some of our concerns, put them in there, but say that this is a little bit outside of our bailiwick to understand. Is that what I'm hearing from folks?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering whether we include it at all since we don't have expertise, but I don't feel strongly about it. I do agree with others. It's
I would love to pass on, because the same list gets recreated everywhere this conversation happens. I think it's helpful to pass on the full list so that no one tries to recreate it again.
yeah.
And just sort of name what would need to happen to figure this out, which is understand the impacts in the rest of the system,
Yeah.
right?
It's one of
Okay.
the silver bullets. The gets thrown out in a variety of
Mhm.
situations.
Yeah.
Okay. Returning healthcare to local districts to bargain. So what is the policy goal of this?
We had testimony at some point that local schools used to be able to bargain wages versus benefits. And now they only have wages. So there's no real trade-off ability. I know some schools saw their costs go up because they were required to convert non-teaching personnel, which they didn't. As a liberal Democrat, I can't have a problem with people getting health care, but it did add to the cost. And their teachers are getting better health care or health insurance, many of them, than they used to, but it did add to the cost.
And I don't know how much of the fact that this is bargained on the state level is why teachers now have better benefits than they used to. It's also like we're in an environment writ large where, labor has more of an ability to negotiate for better benefits. So I want to be careful about sort of the correlation and causation around timing of some of this.
Yes. I
feel like one of my concerns about the ed fund writ large is the more things like this that are locally decided, the more we have one district sort of carrying the other district's decisions and in a way that creates inequity around, teacher hiring, student opportunity, and tax rates.
I'm wondering whether than say return to the local or move to the state, that we say pair all benefits. Look at ways to pair all benefits, because to Ann's point, and as somebody who's been involved in negotiations in two different kinds of systems, when you remove healthcare from the bargaining process, you do remove another lever that prevents schools from looking at other ways to achieve savings when you're looking to increase salary.
So are you saying that salary should be negotiated at the state level?
I think somehow they should be paired. And I'm saying for purpose of our sheet, maybe we, rather than saying return it to the health local, we just say that it should be paired together as a policy decision. And
I think it depends on what the objective is, right? If it's, we heard from at the public session, I think it was in St. Albans, some concern about districts that historically pay lower on this, acting as training grounds for districts that have higher compensation. So they get new teachers, they invest in their, professional development, and then they leave. And so there's more churn happening in the lower socioeconomic districts. So moving to a statewide process would have more of a level playing field. It would be, I think, more expensive because we're not going to have teachers in South Burlington earning less, right? Correct. So I just think it's really being clear on what is the objective. I think what we have seen through statewide bargaining, to your point, Emily, I think the both times it's gone through bargaining, it's gone to arbitration, and both times the arbitrator has selected the union's proposal. And so that may reflect, typically it reflects like what's the norm or what's the least disruptive change to benefits. And so it tends to be a self-perpetuating process where arbitrators are not going to select something that is a departure from what people already have or is out in the marketplace for other public employees. So that's happening at the state level, and everyone's gotten their wants as opposed to piecemeal. Some districts taking longer to
move to the level.
have that dynamic play out.
And that, we heard that from the two chairs, I think testimony on this committee. And that's why they agreed to move forward, extend the contract another
They've
2
basically
years.
given up. I mean, it's
Yes.
basically like, this is just what it's gonna be, because I think from the school board side, it can't get much more advantageous for employees. And it's not gonna, they haven't been successful from a bargaining perspective with an arbitrator reducing benefits, right? So
Well,
it's
I
sort of-
didn't hear them say that they gave up. I actually was really interested in what they said about the fact that they think that the solution lies in something that's not about how they bargain, but in fact what they're bargaining over.
Healthcare reform writ large. I think
Yes.
they have given up on on bargaining to a
Yes.
different result.
Yes, and so I think it's interesting. I think if they've given, like people who really do this have given up of bargaining as a result, then the idea that we think that better outcomes would come from local bargaining rather than statewide bargaining is confusing to me, because I imagine that locals have even less of a capacity to bargain these incredibly complex issues. And so I was,
Plus your equity concern is going to come into play.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
the communities that choose the higher cost plan, they're shifting more of that out.
Mhm.
So are we,
And I would say from the business manager standpoint, many conversations I've had, and I can't say this is like overall as a whole, all of the districts, because I haven't talked to all of them, but many conversations don't seem to lend themselves to thinking that returning healthcare to local districts bargaining is a stellar idea. And I don't really know the reasons why, but it doesn't seem super popular.
I do think there's room for understanding the plan design, so if the state,
Whoa, plan design is line 33. We're not there yet.
Oh, that's the
Oh,
last
wait a
one.
minute.
Yep.
is it
Yeah, I think it
revised
is.
statewide bargaining?
Yeah, I think that's about the plan design.
So to that point, I think we should reword the reduce cost, the how we word that one to say, so to take away return healthcare.
was there like, what's the revision you're recommending? Because what I'm hearing is like, should that even be on the list? But I think I'm
No.
hearing from you that there's maybe a way to tweak it.
If we're looking at line 33, I think maybe that's the piece where
Okay.
I think you're right. I think
Okay, so let's go to line 33. So revised statewide bargaining. I've heard this as a few things. And so to sort of build out the policy goal here, I've heard talk of just sort of revising the balance of power so that teachers wind up paying more. That is just, it's shifting costs off the ed fund. It's not shifting costs out of the system. It's not actually lowering costs, right? It's just shifting who pays for it. There's also changing the plan design, which is what the folks sitting at the table said, so that actually we're reducing costs overall.
take a look at the actuarial value of the healthcare and to examine ways to achieve other savings. I think that's
Right,
what.
I think I was the one who put the note in there about I think there's one in there about actuarial, and that our current plans right now are somewhere between 97 and 98% actuarial cost. And so putting some kind of cap on the actuarial of the plans so that they can't negotiate to be higher than, I don't know, 95%, 90%. I don't know what the cap would be, but
Yeah, I mean, the plans that are offered through VHI are high deductible plans. It's just the deductibles have been covered through negotiations so that the out of pocket, so that the actuarial value is
Yes.
97 to 98%.
right. So
So it is
you've
a
got
function of how it's
HRAs.
been bargained.
If you're a family, you receive $4,000 towards towards your account.
First
to
dollar.
pay for, yes.
Yes.
And so
And it's
what,
first dollar.
and-
Yeah.
Yes.
and so am I understanding that basically what has functionally happened almost accidentally is we wound up with something that costs on total more than a low deductible plan or some other plan and doesn't actually get better healthcare to the people who are, is that?
We've recreated, I think, the old plans
Okay.
so the transition to statewide bargaining happened around the time VHI moved from the Platinum Plus plans to the slate of plans that were sort of similar to what's available on the exchange. That that because of how bargaining transpired, we've recreated the old plan and added some administrative burden because business managers or HR folks need to track and set up different HRA accounts versus HSA as opposed to, so I think that there's, I do think it's worth looking at. It would be a cost shift, right? But one question that is recurring is what's appropriate for property taxes to be paying for in this state, right? Like, what is it that we want to ask property taxpayers to pay for? And maybe it's having health insurance plans that cannot be obtained at virtually any other workplace in the state of Vermont, right? Like, I think that's a conversation. Does the state want to set actuarial targets or actuarial values that VHI then can say, okay, looking at our plan design, we might want to move back to a different type of offering. Or an arbitrator, if it gets to bargaining, can say, this proposal exceeds an actuarial value of 95%. And that, just to put some downward pressure, because right now we're pretty close to no out-of-pocket costs other than the premium share.
So I guess I would offer that even in that context, and I enter these conversations being aware that I could never be a teacher. It is too hard a job for me. And I think I have fairly hard jobs. I have, I live right on the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And so like state by state labor markets are like very vivid for my community. And I know a number of teachers that have moved to work in Massachusetts because their healthcare is better there in the district there than it is here.
Well,
It's a bigger state.
So not that we should match.
How so?
Just,
I think that's worth looking at,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
What are they doing in Massachusetts?
Well, is the plan better? Is the plan and the actuarial better? Or is the service they're getting
System.
from the healthcare
no, the plan
providers
is better. The actual plan is better. Yes.
Huh.
The service, my
Wow.
understanding is the service is actually worse. But anyway, I just sort of want to name that as one of the,
It
like,
may be that the costs are lower. We're a very expensive state,
yes.
right?
It
Like we have.
gets down to the insurance pool. Massachusetts is a bigger,
That's
younger
right.
state. As much as it was nice to talk about putting up to 30-year-olds in Dr. Dinosaur, the pool needs those healthy 30-year-olds paying in to pay for those of us that are less healthy 65-year-olds. I mean, and the bigger the pool, the more you spread, because when it comes down to it, 10% of the people do 50% of the cost of healthcare every year. And the more people you have paying for that 10%, the lower your cost is per person. It's pretty much basic math.
so in this revised statewide bargaining, what I hear people saying is that plan changes are sort of the crux of that. And there's some power shifting as part of that, but the bulk is that the actual underlying plan is what needs to change. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, and I think what it's a terribly complex area, to your point, that health committees really need to look at this.
Yes,
in
100%.
details. And I think with what's going on with the other plan, I think it will be.
Yes, there will have to be some major discussions.
Okay.
And we're ditching row 30 through 32.
Are we ditching those? So I, as one of the people who's going to receive this report, I would like all rows to be included and just opinions about that thing on the row to be named.
Yeah.
Because if it's not included, someone will bring it up and say, why can't we do this? And then we'll just have to recreate the row and have the
With
same
reference
conversation
based
again.
pricing. If we
That
just
makes sense.
decide,
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if everyone here thinks it's a good idea, let's leave the row and put that, say.
As
we don't
a
think this is good
consideration.
idea. Yes.
I agree.
Thank you. Okay, the guiding principles in these sort of in these three buckets. So reference-based healthcare costs, guiding principles are sustainability, affordability.
We don't know
maybe
that.
sustainable.
But we think that if it did what it said to do, then that's what it would do, right? It would create affordability.
It would for this group for some time. Unless you can cut the cost of healthcare, then it's just
spreading it out
who's
there.
paying it.
Mhm.
I'm comfortable leaving it blank on that one.
Okay.
But it's definitely a cost driver for school budgets.
It is one of the biggest.
So I'm gonna say that the returning healthcare to local districts is, I would like to say that it is actually anti-equity.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then revising the statewide bargaining. That is,
That could lead to affordability.
okay.
Um,
Any of the other two principles?
if we revise but maintain, it would maintain equity across districts in terms of the benefits.
Anything else on this whole chunk? Any brilliant ideas about healthcare costs that have not been added to the list? Okay, we are gonna take a 10-minute break. Thank you, everyone. So we are back, delightful stretch. And we are going to pick up on student. I changed on my own private spreadsheet this line item that was special education to student need, and added a new row on mental health costs, because it's just not in the spreadsheet for some wild reason.
We've talked about it.
We have talked about it a lot. I just don't know how it didn't get in here. So let's start with mandating cost limits for therapeutic schools and the policy goals for that.
I'm gonna look to the education people.
Mhm.
But my understanding is it's hard to get a therapeutic school. In some cases, you have to go out of state. So if we say we're not paying your tuition, or we just denying kids treatment, which means we're going to get sued.
So I don't think that's the policy goal of this row though.
Okay.
So let's try to get to the why anyone would want it before we get to why anyone wouldn't want it. I think you've covered why they wouldn't.
I mean, to me, it just gets back to this question around a transparent process for the tuition setting. So whether it's a therapeutic school, whether it's a independent school, whether it's a public high school, if you're charging tuition, what is the level of oversight that is required? There are some therapeutic settings that are very expensive, and that's justifiable in terms of and then I think there's others where it's just very high demand. And so, I think it's a little bit of a black box. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you have any insights, but I mean, I have concerns, yes, about, we already have had several.
Wait, we're not going to concerns yet. Just wait.
Okay.
Can you?
Well, just to your
Okay.
point around incentivizing the opposite
Right.
effect, which is closures of these.
So the goal is more to have transparency. Basically, are you charging for the services you're providing, and what is your success rate that justifies that, as opposed to we're old and have a prestigious name and luxury setting.
Or we're very high demand, we only have so many spots and we can charge whatever
That's it.
whatever we can charge.
Yeah.
And so-
fill those spots.
For me, one of the reasons why this is an important row, and I think the solution might not meet the policy goal, but there needs to be some solution, is when I think about cost drivers, extraordinary special education costs are certainly not the largest portion of the education fund, but I think they might be the absolutely fastest growing
Yes.
item on the education fund.
Yes.
And so that requires significant attention. And I know that AOE is working on a report on special education, but I don't know if it was released and I just missed it, or if it has not been released yet. Not released yet. Okay.
Not really set, but close.
Okay, great. And one thing that I feel aware of there, and I'm curious to read the report, is we passed 173, which perhaps might have created some perverse incentives to move costs into extraordinary special education costs. I don't know, but that's certainly how the numbers seem to be behaving.
At the same time, need exploded.
Yes.
That the finances around extraordinary reimbursement never made any sense to me, because 173 is all about changing practice so it supports students in an inclusive environment, and yet the money was being, it was more funds were being dedicated to extraordinary reimbursement than they were to sort of the block grant.
Yes.
And so to me, it seemed inconsistent. And if that's how it's playing out in other districts, I do think it's worth looking at. And I do think some of the closures that happen actually have forced public school districts and regions to start. I think we heard about this from the BOCES folks, like if there aren't any community-based providers, or the cost of that is becoming prohibitive, can we pool our resources and provide more in-house therapeutic services regionally or.
And I don't want to be too rigid, but we're gonna get to BOCES in a minute.
Right, I'm just saying,
Yeah, no, I know you are.
to your point about,
Costs.
about the costs and the the incentives being sort of in the wrong place. In 173, I think that is a thing.
And so I feel like we've named the policy goal, which is lowering costs, reducing extraordinary special education. And the other impacts might mean that it shuts down, and as you were saying, all of the limited number of spots that are there. And I want to I added a new, just like this might not be the solution, but there needs to be a solution.
We need more so there's this whole like continuum of placements and least restrictive environment. And so if school districts don't have the ability to build programs internally or regionally that support a higher level of need, and it's either you are in a school that is minimally set up to support those needs, or we have to pay tuition to an external setting. Like, I think the continuum needs to be built up a little bit better in terms of least restrictive environment.
I think perhaps
That
the
might help.
standards that are there for referring someone, is there any kind of a, you have to go through other things? I've always wondered if we could, from a state level, provide better training for teachers or staff. Because yes, some of these kids are difficult. And if I don't know how to handle them, and some of us are better at handling than others, it's easier to kind of move them on. And it seems like, or hire a para to sit with them. And it seems like we might be able to do a better job of training at either the local or the regional level.
And I think that's what Lion wrote. Well, I have it as row 40, but I might have moved my rows around. So that's the implementing upstream special education
Yes.
services. And so let's get to that in a minute. So the cost limits on therapeutic schools, I hear the goal is to reduce spending. I hear it might close down all schools, but something needs to change.
I think the goal is
the continuum.
transparency and accountability.
Okay, I have that too.
that's-
Thank you.
okay,
Yes,
great.
transparency, accountability, lowering costs. This might not be the solution, but there needs to be a better built continuum for least restrictive environment. I also want to name for this and all of the rest of sort of special education and mental health related ones that when we look over on the date to curb costs, if something is in a student's IEP, every IEP, like, am I understanding this right? That every single individual IEP will need to be renegotiated and re-signed before anything could actually change for that individual student's plan.
That's correct. If it's in the plan and it's been agreed to by the IEP team, that is what that student is entitled to under federal law.
And so reducing costs in this area has a long arc because of renegotiated plans. So I want to name that. The second one is lowering costs in this area has significant implications for our relationship with the feds because we have a federal obligation around maintenance of effort.
Yes.
So this is like a really sticky wicket in here.
Right, and that's why I think the point about least restrictive environment, like if you don't have a better continuum, and it's either you're here or you're being placed in a really expensive external setting, you have nothing from an IEP team's perspective. There's nothing to put on the table as an alternative to that setting.
We are a small state and we don't have a lot of options.
Right.
Okay, so let's jump.
May I call out something?
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, do I have to do a like Jill Briggs Campbell?
No, but you're very far away from the microphone.
Okay, I'll come over. So I did want to call out something that was in the report that we just sent out, and I don't think it's news to folks at this table. But one thing that is unusual in Vermont is the above average use of paraprofessionals. I think it's a symptom of all of the sort of infrastructure and system issues that we talked about. But it is something that could be folded into this conversation because there is also a cost to having those like one-to-one or small group paras that are providing a lot of special education services in schools. And it is really quite an unusual number. State.
And so I think that's a great segue into implement upstream special education services. So this is hypothetically already in current law from Act 173. Very little of that has been implemented beyond the cost changes, right? The grant changes. The policy goal is increasing the quality of services, lowering costs for staffing and contracted services, and lowering the use of paraeducators.
I think we don't know how well 173 has been. I think some districts have, I mean, it's a major shift.
Yeah.
And I think it takes time, and I think some districts have really been doing that work. But it's for sure uneven. And I think ad hoc.
It's been fairly new. It's taken tremendous energy. My staff is working very hard on it.
Yeah.
But the benefits will take a number of years to see. And at the same time, we're also cutting budgets. So some of those additional pieces that we were looking at for supports can't be there. So it makes this whole transition very complex.
What would it take? So we have over here in our final column, contingency dependencies, AOE capacity is limited its ability to provide necessary professional development at scale, district capacity to meet special education services, revise IEPs, and meet federal law. So because it seems it's difficult and ad hoc, what would it take to do it? Because when the legislature just says, hey, it's in law, follow the law, like that's a somewhat meaningless activity.
We've already got a couple schools who've sent out letters saying you're not going to get your complete IEP services because we can't hire the staff to provide them. And so the question is going to be, if you can't find the staff, as far as I know, we don't have traveling paras yet. But if you can't get the staff, then what do you do? And
I think a lot of this is sort of pre-IEP work, but maybe the idea, it's work that you do in the school before a student would ever be eligible for an IEP or need an IEP. So what will it take? Maybe that's a way longer conversation, but I just want to make sure it's reflected somehow in here.
Well, and I know that's also questions that the secretary has asked on the Listen and Learn tour about what supports we could use. And more, we don't have the scale, so individual districts are doing the work. So in answer to your question, there's a great need for improved or increased technical training and assistance regionally.
And I think quality monitoring and oversight, right? So that's not clear. I mean, if you think you're just doing what you have to do or the best practice, but there's no external support or even irrespective of whether it's focused on 173 implementation, just in general, I think several reports have illuminated the fact that we have no clear central source of truth in terms of how our schools are performing and how our districts are performing. And I think in the absence of that, it's really difficult to make the case for we need to do something different.
I want to spend a minute on mental health costs because it was not in the chart. I think we've already had a bunch of conversations. The designated agencies ideally do this work. Different districts have different challenges accessing those designated agencies. The designated agencies have different capacity to provide those services. In some districts, there's now an arms race between hiring the school districts and the designated agencies, which doesn't really necessarily help kids all that much. Districts are legally required to provide those services. The designated agencies aren't. So it makes sense that the school districts would win the arms race, using so much military language. Sorry. And what?
It's getting to that point.
And the actual policy to do something about it is deeply unclear to me. Has anyone? I want to hand the legislature something other than like, hey, this is a problem, go solve it.
I mean, I do think, we heard this in St. Albans. I mean, that students are showing up to schools in a very different place than they were 5 years ago. That the economic pressures, the housing pressures, the substance abuse, like all of it. And I think schools, rightly so, understand that you can't make progress on reading if a student comes to school in crisis, right? The question is, who should be providing the service, and then how should that service be funded? Should that service be funded with property taxes, or should that service be funded with a more broad-based tax? Are we drawing down enough Medicaid on that? I think that's a real question. Like, has the state leveraged as much possible Medicaid funding to support, not whether it's in school or it's in communities, to meet the crisis that our communities are facing right now? So,
Okay.
I came out of St. Albans saying, got all these doula parenting programs in preschool. I'd like to track whether or not having a child in pre-K childcare, where they do learn some structure and some good parenting, childcare practice, if those kids actually come to school better prepared than kids.
There have been thousands of studies about
We have
that.
the data on that.
Okay,
Hundreds
good.
of thousands of studies
I thought
about
there
that. We
would
can
be,
send them all
but
to you.
listening to St. Albans, I'm saying we should have children and families in those homes before those kids ever come out to school. Somebody should be monitoring whether or not you have more than a 10-word vocabulary.
And I think that actually there's a lot of early intervention in Vermont. We have some of
There
the
has
best
been.
coverage of early
That's what I
intervention in the
thought, so I
state.
listened to the teachers.
Okay, I'm going to jump us into state supportive schools because I was bragging about how we were keeping such a good time and we're totally not. So, state supportive schools, we have BOCES, and then additional administrative supports or standards from AOE. That's like a broad-based category that feels somewhat vague, but is clearly keeps on coming up over and over again, so deserves a row, right? Starting on the first one, additional administrative support from AOE, realizes economies of scale, reduces admin costs, have continuing question about local control versus state. It requires a high functioning agency of education to make it happen. What did I leave out?
So is this saying some of the stuff that's being handled by districts administratively could be handled in a centralized way?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Are there specific, and Mike, we talked about this at the
we did.
trustees. We have all the ed quality standards.
Mhm.
Are there some that are what we might think of as high leverage ed quality standards that we know are good indicators for student success? If a school is doing X really well, we would expect to see movement on student outcomes or student success, whatever, however you're defining success. I think for the purposes of what you're working on there, I think that we actually have a lot of alignment and consensus on this. It's about prioritizing, right? So what are those high leverage standards? And then if we agree upon those, Craig, what you're signaling is some of this is about our accountability framework, which is sort of baked into the recipe, that there is a lot of local control. and this is actually a place where local control is a thing. It's not like when we talk about local control for funding, there's a bit of a myth there, right? But when it comes to things like local districts are required to have a coordinated curriculum, but there is no state standard for a coordinated curriculum.
We
That
don't have,
A
yes,
lot of work for
Yes.
districts to do. But the agency doesn't actually have the authority to approve. So are there things that could be changed in statute that would give the agency the ability to exercise a bit more standardization, oversight, and then accountability?
I'm going to attempt to take what was a very nuanced paragraph and make it one line for a spreadsheet. So I'm so sorry about what's about to happen.
That's okay.
I wrote agency of education capacity and relationship to the education quality standards, communicate standards and support or approve them.
And I think
I
it's,
think she's talking about statewide curriculum.
and even.
Are you
things like
talking about the statewide
class-
curriculum and not being willing to say that out loud?
No, I'm
Okay.
happy to say it.
Okay, you said that
No,
loud?
no,
Okay.
I didn't know
Okay,
she
great.
said it out loud.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Happily.
okay.
And I think most of the field would say like, please, like give us, if it's not one statewide curriculum, because most states have more than one, but. And then Mike, I can see you want to jump in.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm also saying is we can't do we collectively, I mean, the field, I mean, the agency, we can't do everything in EQS standards right now. It would dilute the impact. What are the key priorities that we would want the field to focus on and the agency to focus on to make sure that we are collectively doing that work really, really well? So things like a coordinated curriculum, things like proficiency-based learning, right? Making sure that we're
requirements.
doing it really well. And if we have standardization, we can measure.
Okay.
Right now, we can't measure.
we do not have a standards aligned system right
We
now.
do not have a standards aligned system.
And you can have pieces in place. You can have model that is the starting point and helps align that system that doesn't mandate that everything looks exactly
That's
alike.
right.
Okay.
It's not a no child left behind, thou shalt teach X, Y, and Z. It's let's actually do the work of creating, Mike, you said it better than me, a standards aligned system. But we actually have to signal that there's places where the agency needs more capacity and more accountability and prioritization of this work. And then there's places where they literally don't have the authority.
Proficiency-based learning, example.
Proficiency-based learning, class size, right? I actually had the EQS standard open this morning. The agency doesn't have any authority to set minimum class sizes. It's not in there. So are there key things that would drive some of these outcomes that we're looking for? And then we need to,
Okay.
I'm optimistic on this. I actually think we probably have quite a bit of consensus on this.
Mhm.
And it's just a matter of honing in on those and then doing that work.
And creating capacity for that work.
Yes, but it's also, if you prioritize what that work is, then it's also our ability to look within the agency and say, oh, we actually have those content experts.
They're just doing other things.
They're doing other things.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So and that's part of our own strategic plan and alignment.
Okay.
That could be work accomplished in this session, I would say. So I think it's
I
important.
think all of this has to be work accomplished in this section.
Some of it though, I mean, some of it is going to take longer, right? Transforming the delivery of special education is going to take a really long time because it's a lot of training, right? And a lot of
Legal framework.
legal frameworks,
Yeah.
accountability. But
And who knows what's going to happen to that?
Okay, so I'm gonna move on to BOCES because I am starting to panic about all of the tax policy we have to talk about still. Okay. BOCES, we've talked about reducing administrative costs. It fits into the other conversation we were having. Folks have questions about how voluntary enrollment is gonna yield results. District's capacity to launch these and collaborate on them. It only saves money if efficiency is gained.
Right.
rather than
It can't
adding
be just
another level of
another
administrative.
layer of administrative.
Yes. Okay, anything missing from that? Okay, moving on. Oh, guiding principles.
I would suggest, Emily, just also explore existing tools. right? Consortium agreements. Could we actually make simple changes to statutory language around consortium agreements that would make them easier and more effective without creating additional governance structures? We may want to turn over a few stones before we
Create a new structure.
create a new structure. I'm concerned
Yes.
about that might actually be counterproductive to where we might be going in the next few years.
Okay. Core values or guiding principles, sorry. Guiding principles on BOCES and the daily capacity
I
question.
think part of it is equity,
Mhm.
very clearly.
Yes.
And if done well, it could be more affordable.
Mhm.
Or more sustainable.
I think very much quality.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think this is an area where quality is actually top of the list. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, school construction, this is on this list. There's an entire parallel working group working on this. And so I don't want us to spend very much time on it because they're actually just going to be delivering a full report and our row loses its importance and just name that much money is needed and it's very unclear where that money is going to come from.
Hopefully, the money aligns with the overall policy goals of the state. and we're
Yes.
not
Yes.
Going into different
I
directions.
think we can
And-
say that.
Yes.
Rules, because there's not going to be enough money to do everything that needs to be done at once. That school construction needs to align with the goals of the commission. That is the equity, sustainability, affordability.
Okay.
I don't want to see standards before we have actual clean water in the school.
No, and basically our entire second section of policy goals really don't work without the school construction work moving forward as well. Okay. I'm gonna move on from that section unless someone else has something they want to say. Okay. Craig, it's your time to shine.
Okay. let's do it.
Okay. So adjusting current non-property revenues to the education fund. I'm gonna sort of highlight an ongoing comment throughout that whole section, which is that these ideas might reduce the share that needs to be raised by property taxes, but they do not reduce the overall amount of money that needs to be raised.
Correct.
And that's said multiple times throughout this section.
Does anything say it does not identify what might need to be cut elsewhere in order to provide these funds?
We will, yes, that is on transfer revenue. We're going to start with add more revenue.
Okay.
Okay, so adding more revenue, some of that could be available in 2025, but actually a lot of it would probably not be available until 2026. New revenue is rarely available in the year it's past. There is possibility of economic harm on every tax proposal, and every tax proposal has a unique impact. Also, we have named identifying a sustainable funding source or using revenue as a bridge to new funding governance and delivery model. I think we don't have this all mapped out on a year-by-year basis, but some of these changes are going to take a while to reduce costs. Are there short-term, this is sort of said a few times throughout this, are there short-term revenue options that could be a bridge to a full rethink of the system, which is what everyone seems to be coming to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the legislature has often, over the years, identified some one-time money to make the property tax burden work politically or whatever. And I think, but it's never been tied to or in service of, I don't want to say never, but it is not always
Tried to
tied
do it
to a
with
policy
46.
goal that has a timeline established.
We
So,
tried to do it with 46 with limited success, but there was school construction and there was
some tax rate reductions.
tax rate reductions and things attached to that bill.
Yeah.
To encourage.
But I do think it's important that we be clear and realistic. You know, there's been a lot in the press in the last week or so, like, we have to do something, on property taxes. And we have just gone through an exercise that does it pretty clearly, like, at least on the cost driver side, there's no flipping of a switch to say. And so realistically, it may be needing to identify either a short-term revenue source or a one-time money, the immediate term to build that.
We'll get to one-time money in a minute. When we talk about adding more revenue, I also want to name, and this is in the chart, so not new information, there are actually very few revenue sources that are more progressive than property taxes. And so I know it's paid my property taxes last week. Like it's real and terrible and staring you right in the face. And the economic harm of it is actually less likely than, say, a change in the sales tax, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so just sort of want to, I think that's an important piece of this being wrestled with.
I think if you had it deducted every month and it like you ever sit down, add up the interest payments you're making on your credit card, because you pay that in a monthly installment and you pay it off. Whereas property taxes hit you in one big bill. It's like my car insurance, you know, and then when it goes up, I know it went up. And that, I don't know that there's just not a way, I don't think, to have it be a monthly deduction that you might get money back from at the end of the year. But,
Well, I do believe, I'm going to speak for some people, not myself, and say a lot of people think that would be the value of moving to an income-based
yes,
education funding system.
it's,
Not many costs.
But we will get to that in a section. I'm not advocating for it. I'm just,
I mean, I think more and more are escrowing it too, right? Like, so it's not that you have a system where you get money back at the end, but I think for a lot more, a higher and higher percentage are probably paying through just their mortgage payment.
yeah, you could ask.
do you have data on that? Because I imagine given the number of older Vermonters, we actually have fewer and fewer people paying on it via escrow.
Well,
So
I
that
could
would
be
be-
wrong. I don't have data on it.
Okay, let's get some data on that.
I don't know how.
That's
but I
me.
could
We will,
Ask.
let's try to figure out how.
Well, speaking of data, I mean, I do think we've talked about this, the associations have talked about just sort of the balance of revenue. And I think the report that came out on Friday sort of alluded to this, like we're heavily reliant on property taxes to fund education more so than other states. And it'd be good to know exactly what that is, because I think while there's a lot of stability associated with property taxes, there is some progressivity because of our property tax credit. So I think that's problematic because we pay for the credit out of the ed fund. So other property taxpayers are paying for the, you know, if it's a true income-based system, there would be I think, an income tax-based transfer over to make up for that. But I do think it's worth being really clear about how Vermont compares to other states in terms of the reliance on property taxes.
So there's
And
one.
whether there needs to be more balance.
Okay, so let's get to that in a second. So transferring revenues. I think there's a real question that Anne brought up about what are you not funding then out of the general fund when you transfer revenues into the education fund? Is it funding for the designated agencies so that they can meet, right? Is it building schools so that we would have more, building housing so that people would have, we would be expanding the grand list. Like it's not, the general fund is not infinite. And so transfers have trade-offs even to education quality and property taxes.
See that the other money chairs have gotten very good at channeling the appropriations.
Yeah, but I mean, there has also been some big price tag items that have been transferred into the ed fund when sales and use was doing well, and teachers' retirement costs being a $50 million price
That's
tag.
only your present. That's what all employers pay. It's your present employer's payment. we've put hundreds of millions of dollars into the retirement fund, all out of the general fund, including putting teachers, retired teachers' health care on something stable with a fund that's invested rather than pay as you go out of the corpus. So there's been some trade-offs. But yeah, you do have,
That's a cost that's been,
Right.
that used to be borne in the general fund that is not.
that is
borne
not
in the general fund anymore.
when we had to true up the general fund for pensions.
So when I look at diversifying the revenue sources, a lot of what you just said, Nicole, is in here. I also see that the premise of the idea is sort of unclear, given that we actually don't have local spending. We don't have local taxes. It is all state money. And so when we're talking about the mix, is it a mix of, it's not a mix of state and local spending, it's all state spending. But I hear you talking about, it's actually the mix of property taxes versus non-property taxes.
We call it a state tax, but shows up, I mean,
No, it's a state tax.
it's a statewide tax.
It's a statewide tax.
On property.
Yes.
Yes, it's a statewide property tax. I also see a note, if education spending was in line with other states, property tax revenue as a percentage of other sources would be more in line with other states. Does any, what does that mean?
That came from us, but I don't have the data on it, but it's like the logical point of property taxes are the shock absorber. And I think we're second highest per pupil spending in the country. That is going to be, and I also have to say, I'm not trying to dispute your point. I just don't know how true or not it is. I've asked my team to like look at it, and it's really hard to do apples to apples comparison across states. But let's just take the premise that it is true. If we have a higher than almost everybody per pupil spending, and property taxes are the shock absorber of that, it's going to mean that would be one of the drivers about why our composition of revenue is out of whack compared to other states. And I don't know what it looks like, for instance, if the total education spending is like what it looks like in the PICUS model, like then where is our composition of revenue? I don't know. I haven't had time to like dig into that, but that's the point that's being made in that section.
And I hear we need a lot more information about what that composition looks like, what sort of national standards are. And it is going to be hard to get because of how taxes are sort of much more stacked in other states than we stack them here.
They have a lot more to tax. We have a relatively small tax base. We don't have any minerals that anybody wants to pay an extraction tax for.
I was just at a conference where people from Alaska were like bragging about their
Yes.
everything. I was like, no one needs to hear from you.
But we have
Like,
property that we don't tax. We have current use. We have tips. We have property that we have
Well, we do
decided
tax.
we're not going to.
we do. So I will,
Right.
in defense of current use, it's
Yeah.
not that we don't tax it, it's that we actually tax it at the value of that
We
land. And
tax
that's
it
what
less
No.
than,
it's considered,
that we
but that is the
tax
value
at
of
what?
that land.
And we would have less green space. There's trade-offs in all of these things. Got a motel in downtown St. Albans, and we've got a thriving downtown, which we are now taxing, getting close to taxing at rate.
Okay, is there anything on diversifying the sources that we have not covered?
well, I just to correct one, I think it's both, right? It's not one or the other, right? I am interested in looking at some of the higher spending states like New Jersey and New York, I think, spend more per
I think
people
New
than we
York
do.
is highest.
So what's the balance, what's the mix there? But I don't think any of us are saying it's gotta be this one thing is gonna fix it. It's like,
Agreed.
yes, we're gonna look
Yeah,
at
for
all
sure.
of this stuff and.
I hope
And
I wasn't-
revenue
I hope it
mixed to well, your point about spending, yes, we just spent 2 hours talking on the spending
Right.
side. And I think is the revenue mix the right mix for the policy goals that we have. as a
I mean.
Because we spend what has been built over decades and decades.
Mhm.
It's not, we're not schools aren't creating money to spend more. But at the same time, there have been pieces added to the education fund that require those amounts. And we also have a system that, as we talked about with school construction and size of schools, that has more schools because of our rurality. So I think it's important to also mention that when you look at the higher spending states, which, Vermont is 2, most of them are in the Northeast. So there's some other reasons why we are in that category.
And I guess I would challenge you on the idea that we have lots of smaller schools because of our rurality, and say it's because of very specific policy choices we've made related to our rurality. There are lots of very rural states that do not have that many small schools.
I would agree.
Okay.
You're correct. I stand corrected on
Thank
that.
That's what we say it is.
Yes.
But yeah,
And to get
the statistics that got thrown out is we are like the most rural or second most rural because we have the most people that live in towns with less than 25,000 people. There was a number. And I'm saying, but if you're in Montana or Idaho, those towns are 30 miles apart. Ours are 10 miles apart. They're small, but we aren't as spread out as Texas.
there are a lot of different ways to define rural, and I think we
Yes.
all pick the one that pleases us in the moment
Yes.
that we need it.
We do.
But just a question for
Myself
Craig.
included.
This is something that I saw that was done in 2022. Is that something that's been updated?
This looks like one of our fact sheets, yeah, on
Yes.
our website. I don't know if it's been updated.
Okay.
I would doubt it,
Okay.
but it likely could be.
Okay. Because you were mentioning that your team was working on it. I just was wondering if that was one of
Well,
the things you were thinking about.
What I had asked was like, can we figure out like what the composition is for share of property taxes compared to other states?
Okay.
Which we
Yes.
haven't been able to get
Okay.
through that much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Next we have expanding sales tax to services.
Big change.
It's a big change. Do you want to say more about what's big about that change, Craig?
Oh, yeah, I mean, we don't tax most services now. There are some states that tax a lot of services, tax most services, all services.
Can you give an
So-
example of a service that would be taxed?
Legal services.
Yeah,
Okay.
tax preparation services, things like that.
Haircuts.
Hair salons.
So like states like Washington, I think, tax a lot of services. A lot of states don't tax services and have focused their sales tax on tangible personal property. Again, we have some, like if you're renting tangible personal property, that counts. Going to certain kind of entertainment venues in Vermont counts. So I think it would be a big change in terms of just what's getting taxed. It would be a big change for those industries to start collecting the tax. It would be a big change for tax administration to be doing, compliance, audits, and all that kind of stuff.
And one of the things, big changes to tax administration is like really being clear if the juice is worth the squeeze,
Mhm.
right? New tax types are very expensive. Like, you're really getting in my head.
Yeah.
And
Good.
if you expand,
New computer.
if we expand like a sweeping expansion, often a tax on services can become like quite a pink tax. And that in addition to being sort of, in the same regressivity that a sales tax can be, is also then you have it's also regressive in a gendered way, which is probably not one of our goals. And then there are services like accounting and legal services that have sort of less of those gendered or regressive pieces, but also you can have lots of problem with how those would sort of stack with business inputs. And not to say that it shouldn't be done, just to say it's, just as complicated as all these other things.
The biggest services too are what, education and healthcare probably, and it's.
Yeah.
Probably won't tax those.
That would defeat the
Right.
And that's another like, and whenever you introduce something like this and you build in a lot of exemptions, then you wind up is the juice worth the squeeze problem.
We have 50 in Vermont.
You'd have to start it in gradually. And probably it's something like legal or accounting services. But if you tax haircuts, that's just going to add to the inflationary, pressure that people are feeling, something they do every day.
And then on legal services, someone's brought up to me, do you really want every attorney in the state house arguing with you about something?
Do I get a raise?
You do not get a raise under any circumstances. Okay, anything else on sales tax services? Okay,
The original Blue Ribbon did do a whole recommendation on that. And it basically was that you could tax services and lower the tax rate, which would,
Lower the sales
Help,
tax?
yeah.
Right.
yeah, which would, it wouldn't raise revenue, but it would help with the, because their charge was competitiveness. Why aren't we competitive? Why won't businesses move here? And so it was lower the tax rate, and that would help with that cross-border, God love New Hampshire that we have. And, but it was, again, complex and difficult to do, and you had to do a lot in order to be able to lower the rate.
Okay. I'm gonna move on to,
Hold on.
Oh.
Where are we?
we are on row 68.
Wow.
Chunking it down.
Oh, so you just combined all those,
What?
the diversify, expand, all.
I thought we talked, did we not talk about all of them?
I think we did. We
Am I
just
close to
combined them
where
into a
we-
sort of a scroll.
Well, because whenever I tried to stick to one, someone
Yeah,
would
we
jump to
all just
another
go.
one and I
Fair enough,
gave up.
fair enough. Taxing millionaires, is that what we're on to?
We are on taxing millionaires. I imagine that what this meant, and I'm not the person who created that item, was that we were talking about a new tax bracket for higher, a new high income
500,000 and
bracket.
up.
So one, just sort of name that actually only raises around $70 million, which will not get us out of our property tax hole, though it is certainly one piece of the puzzle. Would not be available in the current year. There's also questions about other competing needs, like money for designated agents, like all the general fund needs that we would be removing opportunity for.
Felt like this one was just a subset of the add more revenue line.
I agree.
It was just a specific policy proposal for that.
Mhm.
This is another silver bullet that's being pushed by groups. But when the actual not, and they're using 74 million. But to those of us that think in terms of hundreds, maybe thousands, if we're really lucky, 74 million sounds like a lot of money, but in the context of the impact it would have, it really isn't a lot of money. And I think we can assume at least some. It also is the biggest churn, right? Half the people in that bracket won't be there next year. So it's somebody that sold their business and that's their retirement account.
I mean, my understanding of the evidence is that that's not as true as it used to be.
No, it still holds. We redid it last year.
And-
50% is 1 year.
Forever though, or I thought people were bouncing back and forth above and below the line.
Don't know if I can speak to that with
Okay.
credibility.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm gonna,
Actually, no, I think it's like 1 year, 1 year out of 10, they're in that bracket.
really?
I think so.
Okay.
We can take it
Let's-
further
okay.
offline.
Property tax surcharge on second homes. I think this has been sort of added, a little more nuance was added to it by one person, which was supporting splitting the non-homestead into its component parts.
Yes.
And someone described that as giving the General Assembly additional policy levers for revenue. I see someone saying it would reduce second home ownership possibly and shift the burden of the education tax, reduce homestead taxes and possibly rental taxes.
Rental is an issue. I mean, rent gets passed on, so you increase that tax. Last year when we were playing with levers, Down Street Housing, which is my local Champlain Housing Trust, they are limited to a percentage of income that they can charge people for rent. So they can't pass on last year's 18 or 14% in, and they aren't for profits. They don't have the money to pay that. So what do we do with them? The local communities are already limited by a formula to what they can assess them at. They can't assess them at full market value, which is annoying them because sometimes they do have to provide more than average services there. So rental, we've got to do something. I think our new renters rebate thing has solved some of the problem for standard renting. But if we're going to, I think we do need to divide it down. I think everybody's thinking of the $2 million houses. We did exclude last year when we were talking about this. It has to be habitable year round, meaning it has to have heat, indoor plumbing, and maybe insulation, because God forbid we can't tax anyone's deer camp.
I mean, Hawaii, for example, has maybe 7 categories of property for the purposes of property taxation, and resorts are their own category. But I think, there is a lot of administrative complexity in this that needs to be covered, including the fact that each of our grand list designations are done in some degree of isolation by each town.
Right.
And so to create equity in that system would be quite complicated. And we have a report coming about it all.
We
in
do.
Yes.
2 weeks,
Nope.
3 weeks. 4 weeks?
Just under December 15th.
Great. I knew that. I just didn't know how far away the December 15th was. Okay. Anything else that needs to be said on that one?
So the report that's coming out on the 15th is looking at the component
It's,
parts.
yeah,
and
it's
what would
big.
be-
It's a big report on sort of the reappraisal system as a whole, because the
Mm.
legislature passed a 6-year reappraisal cycle. So it's discussions about how to do that, and then discussions about property categories on the grant list.
Mhm.
I think sort of with an eye to like, can they be disaggregated? How can that?
Right.
Okay.
And
It is
how would it be
complicated.
administered
Right.
if the state,
The only other thing I would say, right, is that we're in the category of property tax reduction proposals, and this is not one. This is a proposal to reduce homestead property taxes,
It is indeed.
but not all property taxes.
Mhm.
Yeah, it would not reduce everybody.
unless the
Here,
overall
I'll
cost
change the
trajectory
very
changes.
top category, ideas to reduce homestead.
Well, some of the others would reduce
All of them.
property
Yeah, if you add
taxes.
revenue, different, if you
Yes,
diversify
okay.
the revenue.
So it's just
Okay.
a nuance with this specific.
No, that's,
Well, and I think just the housing climate that we're in, I think it's worth looking at. Are there opportunities to
I hate to tell you, but a
incentivize
housing
different
tip
types
has
of-
been suggested because the cost of the site work for $300,000 house and a 500 or million is essentially the same. You got to put water and sewer, maybe septic in there. We've got issues with town capacities. And so if you could have the towns bond to do that work. I know Montpelier is going to have a bond on the town meeting to do, I don't know how many homes up here in Isabel Circle to pay that infrastructure cost. So that's floating around out there. I wouldn't be surprised to see it come in a bill.
and we actually don't have anything about TIFs anywhere in here, and I don't think we have time to tackle TIFs
No, we don't.
today. So I'm going to move to going to an income-based tax for education. There's an entire report about that is linked in the
It was a good report.
it's a very good
Yes.
report. It's one of my very favorite reports.
Can someone summarize for me? It's been talked about, it's always out there,
It's
and it's been studied. So what are the reasons not to do it?
it's unbelievably complex, and it's very unclear if it's actually implementable at all, ever, especially given our existing system.
It's
If our entire system of how we deliver money and budget for schools was changed, then it might be much more possible. But given our existing budgeting and funding structure, it's
The local budget
Not-
development
yes.
process, the local approving process does
Yes.
not lend itself to.
And
an
plus
income tax.
the equity, we couldn't find a way to just zap those at the top. It had impacts frequently at the top and at the bottom. It's like the last set of tax cuts. The people, there were groups that lost, and one of them was at the bottom. And so,
It's those who are in the more modest value homes. I think it's
It's actually quite striking.
I think it's an important piece because I think there's a myth with our existing property tax credit system that everybody under the income limits gets a property tax credit, and that's not true.
Right.
There are people who live in like really modest homes, like mobile homes, for instance, might have a very low appraised value, and they're better off paying by property and not by income. And so those folks got hit. The other thing from my standpoint as a tax administrator that's really challenging is I have really hard time seeing how it improves transparency in the system. Because I think today about somebody who gets a refund, a tax refund, and that's a combination of maybe they're withholding from their job, their earned income tax credit, their child tax credit. I'm hard pressed to think that taxpayers understand which of those components are doing to which part of their refunds. And so now if you were to layer on top of it the whole education system, like I don't know how regular taxpayers are going to know how much they're paying for education. They're just going to have a big income tax bill at the end of the year. A portion of that will be their regular income tax. A portion of that will be their education tax. And it's like they might have other things that offset that, because why would we bill somebody separately if they had a refund because of their earned income tax credit? So I think it actually reduces transparency in the system because
In other words,
And I know you have a whole life to live, but it's like genuinely a great report. I
oh,
recommend reading it.
believe
That's
me,
the
I've,
first one you
I've-
told me to
I've-
read.
I've skimmed through it.
Yes.
But so just so,
Yeah.
it makes it harder for voters to have a connection between the budget that they approve and the taxing
in my view.
impact. And so theoretically speaking, if we went to a system where, like that report revealed, other states have, this is how much money you have to spend on your budget.
If we went to a
We
foundation.
went to
formula,
a
it's impossible.
situation like that, it would be easier to say, we're gonna set a base rate for property and we're gonna fill a gap with an income, with a broad-based income tax. And that's just gonna, how we're gonna fund it, as opposed to having it be keying off of this district by district decisions.
And if we did that, it would likely then just be an income tax and not a income-based property tax,
Correct.
Yes.
Right.
which is a different
Yes.
thing than that.
Which is a
Right.
different thing
We're
than
just
that,
gonna
and which
raise
other
some
property
people's
taxpayers
taxes.
pay for anyway.
it's increasing revenue.
And if we, again, if, we sort of have the income tax piece further up, that does reduce capacity for using income tax for other things.
Hmm.
In the general fund. Okay, we have just a perfect segue just then into changing the structure of the education fund. We have moving expenses not within the control of districts outside of the education fund.
We have like a list of those within this spreadsheet.
What the expenses are?
Yeah.
No, it's a hotly debated issue about whether something is within control or not within control.
Sure, that's why I was hoping to get rid of them.
No.
Those are called unfunded mandates, and the one I always heard about was driver's ed, but I haven't heard about that in a while.
Yeah, and that's unfunded mandates, I think is a whole other. I think this is referring to specific line items in the Ed Fund Outlook that are dedicated to programs like universal school meals, for example.
If the education community wants to be responsible to the public for doing away with feeding hungry children,
Just using it as an
go
example.
ahead.
This is,
I don't know if I'm even with you on that end. What I think one of the pieces of this that I fear gets lost in the wash sometimes of the debate is that often things have been taken over as state funded sort of above the line education fund costs. Because when they are done at the local level, given our existing funding formula, there's tremendous inequity in who is receiving that and who is paying for it. And so the more things, from my perspective, that move above the line, the actual more opportunities there are in equity, both taxpayer equity and equity within the system of opportunity for kids. So if we use school meals as an example, there were lots of districts that were providing universal meals before we passed universal meals. And everyone was paying for that. Certainly, if we got rid of it, there would be even more districts doing it and everyone would be paying for it. But it's not paid for sort of as when it's above the line, everyone gets that opportunity while everyone pays for it, instead of just some people getting that opportunity and everyone paying for it. So given the statewide fund, like moving the idea that there's a delineation between those two things is hard for me.
Do we know how many districts were paying for?
We do, there's a report, but I don't remember that number.
The number,
And certainly most people have thrown out their cash registers at this
some
point.
schools would lose a lot of money if we did away with it.
And we'd also lose federal money. And I'm just using it as sort of an example of what happens when things are above the line versus below the line.
But this is talking about moving things, not,
Yes.
not
Not doing away
remove,
with
like not repealing things.
Yes.
Yeah. Because I think that was your point, Nicole, was you could move it to the general fund,
Sure.
Okay.
not repeal it.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, my point is, what's the purpose of the ed fund? It was created to have it move to a statewide property tax
Mhm.
system where all the money gets bundled together and then sent back out. And it's a self-balancing fund.
Yes.
And so there are, I mean, I think, and you've said this before, I mean, it's a place where programs can be created, and they just get funded. Whereas if you had to have a conversation around trade-offs
Mhm.
in the general fund, maybe the outcome would have been different or not clear. But the point is, the property tax is taking on responsibility for anything that gets added into the ed.
Can I
I've always,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's what I always call the law of big pots of money.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
So with,
About the law of big pots of money.
yeah, no, basically, yes. So more what you said, Nicole, about the that if it was in the general fund, there would be a conversation about trade-offs. So mental health costs are hypothetically in the general fund already. There has been conversations about trade-offs, and because of that, it's underfunded. School districts are under a federal mandate to provide these services to students, right? And so what we now have is two parallel systems, because one is underfunded, and so the other one is picking up the slack in maybe not as an efficient or effective way as the original system would if it was fully funded. And so given that sort of like district desire or mandate to constantly fill the gap, what happens when those trade-offs are made and things are underfunded? Because everything in the general fund is underfunded, basically.
And it is.
Well, and I think the mental health question, when I look at things like behavior interventionists, pieces like that, I think that there's other pieces too, other complexities when schools are making those decisions, as opposed to the designated agencies who have expertise in that area and have different sets of rules. Because that's the system I'm used to, where it wasn't a school's choice to do that. There was other oversights, medical verifications and pieces like that. So I think that's a little more complex than some of the other pieces I think that Nicole was mentioning.
But what I hear you leaning towards is like, so let's say we did move cost to the general fund, that would mean that the education fund would then not be allowed to fund that.
Well, and I do
Is
think
that what that's paired with?
there's different sets of rules that you have to abide by, and it's not the school making that decision. It's a designated agency, mental health agency, who's saying, here's the criteria for this specific service.
Are all the behavioral issues we're seeing a result of mental illness? Are we really seeing an X% increase in mental illness, diagnosed mental illness among students, or are we seeing a rapid increase in behavioral issues.
Well, I think there's a real question about what, if there's a line between those two things that
Well,
you're drawing as brightly as you
Well,
are.
I think that's it. I don't think there's a bright line, but there definitely is an increase in student behavior that is not conducive to a educationally, you know, to a climate in school where other students can learn.
Does the special education report that's coming include behavioral and mental health or just?
We, I don't believe so called out as like a line item, right? And
Okay.
part of that is because we struggled to do that. We actually tried to do that. We tried to model it and we immediately fell into
Yes.
this morass of, right, like what is social emotional learning and wellness? What is behavior? What is mental health supports? It became, and also that a lot of those costs are also coded as sped costs.
Okay.
So we almost like we went out, we like had a methodology, we showed it to the field. Some folks were like, oh, it's good enough. And other folks said, no way, this is way off. So it's a really challenging thing to try to quantify and therefore to try to take out of it. Like, what would it look like? Would it look like grants? Maybe it's general fund grants that get made to schools while we do try to address the systemic kind of need for community-based mental health. Like, it's a conversation that we're having right now. And I think we could like collectively try to do some work around that. But we found it really, really challenging almost immediately.
And I think all these pieces are just tied together, right?
Yeah.
Like, so again, I'd be interested in how we compare to other states. Like, how do other states fund, transportation aid to schools, special education aid to schools? Are they relying on 70% of the revenue coming from property taxes? Or are they saying this is raised from a broad-based revenue source, whether it's an income tax, whether it's, I just think the ed fund has gotten out of whack in terms of the draw and in terms of the balance.
And it's probably less restrictive than that, right? It's probably not like we're paying for this aid with this. It's like they don't have as big of a statewide education fund because the system isn't set up in the same way.
Right.
Right. So it's like, I mean,
payments to districts.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, like this is, I mean, this is a way to help diversify. And I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I also feel like maybe it's just the discussion about the, like, you don't have to account for it, but we've been talking today about that tension of like state government being able to put some guardrails around this and like more things in the general fund that take a more proactive discussion, do put some more guardrails around things.
Can I offer something?
Yeah, and we're like super running out of time.
So one approach that states take to this is sort of a hybrid. And there's like position-based formula funds, or there's like sort of adequacy-based formula funds, right? Some states take a hybrid approach to try to address some of these exact things. So they will say, we recognize that, fake example, there are specific mental health needs, and that we can sort of quantify that for every X number of students, you really do need X number of specialists. And therefore that's a position based, but you don't do that for everything, right? Because then it's actually quite restricted. Schools can only build those budgets and use those funds. But maybe for certain categories, we say, we really do need, whether it's contracted or positions, X number of highly qualified individuals to serve this population of students, and therefore we bake that into the formula. One thing we could contemplate as we're trying to think about what this might mean if you tried to move these costs out of the ed fund is if we could get a handle on what that looks like, then that actually becomes like extracted from the ed fund and moved over to the general fund.
Well, I think that is a good segue to adjusting the funding formula, because then it's once it's sort of clear on how we're spending the money, then where that money comes from gets sort of a lot more clear and a lot more nuanced.
How many rows do we have left?
A lot.
Really?
Yes.
Isn't this the last section?
It's the last section, but it's a long one.
Darn.
Okay, so we have add a statutory requirement for new programs and mandates to have a sustainable funding source. The legislature can't really control tie the hands of future legislatures, but we could put that in statute and see whether or not people follow it in the future.
No,
I
we're
passed it
perfect.
out.
Okay,
That's already sort of isn't it like it's already required that there's.
Property
fiscal
taxes.
load And
Yeah.
all the stuff, this gets not withstood.
Our favorite phrase.
okay. And like, for the example of school lunches, if we'd actually added a revenue source when we passed universal school meals, then we would have actually had an even bigger hole further down the line. So, okay. Adjusting the funding formula, eliminating the new CLA. The December 1st letter is going to have the new CLA in it already. And so it might be even
It's some
more confusing.
adjustments.
Just for the record, I hate the new CLA.
Yes.
Everyone hates the new
Yes.
For a system that's already complicated.
It adds
to
another
now
layer.
have to explain
does
it.
do
Yes.
that.
Oh my
yes.
God,
Yes.
but
It does.
That wasn't a personal comment.
No, I mean, we were, yeah, we didn't come up with it.
sales, but it is.
For my chair, it adds complexity, but it also does reduce some of that like unexpected volatility, I guess, but it's.
I mean,
it
maybe
adds
the
complexity.
January meeting will be less like, ugh. But it's still complicated. It's
I think the
really just
idea-
complicated to explain.
Was that it would narrow the gap between a district's tax rates and a town's tax rates, which is where the bulk of the screaming we get comes
Okay.
from. And anything that we can do to
Animals, they
narrow
scream
that
and we
gap, the better off we are.
Yeah, I'm single town, single district.
Yeah. No pain
No, we have 6 towns, so I understand.
Okay,
Okay,
all right. I think
and
we
so
can-
Herd, I'm gonna move on.
Yeah.
Okay. We are now on line around 92.
Oh, wow. Oops.
Okay. Better tying local votes of reduced local spending to district tax rate reductions. So this is an unbelievably abstract thing to say. And I don't know if someone wants to explain what they mean by that.
I'm the guy who put that on the original
Great.
brainstorm, and it is funding formula change.
Okay,
That's what I mean.
okay.
I mean, we've highlighted it here, right? Like the districts who are having those very difficult decisions, and then if they feel like they're doing that alone, like it is very true. If you are a district who makes a decision to cut a teacher, you will feel that loss in your district, but you will not feel all of that savings. And likewise, if you spend more, you will not pay for all of that. And
So-
there are all the historical reasons for that, and maybe also better ways to do it.
And so is this the same as another somewhat vague sentence, which is set clear targets for appropriate per pupil spending and set education fund incentives to meet that best practice via direct payments to districts, which is essentially a lot of words for a foundation formula.
I don't think I wrote that one, but.
I wrote
would
that
be-
very vague sentence.
Okay, that would be one way to do it, I think,
Okay.
yes.
So this foundation formula business, we've had a foundation formula. It was struck down as unconstitutional. So I guess I get stuck on like, okay, so how do we, if we're still able to have local communities decide to spend more,
So
how is that different from where we were?
So a few things. One, I think the biggest part of Act 60 that, one of the biggest parts of I'm not an attorney. But one big part of Act 60 that is about the Brigham compliance piece is the statewide grand list. Which would still, I haven't heard a proposal around something like a foundation formula that did away with the statewide grand list at all. And so that is like one of the biggest pieces of equity that I haven't heard anyone talking about removing. And so that's sort of one piece about why it would still be constitutional. Again, I'm not an attorney, and then any of this would get decided years down the road after something passed. But there's that piece. There's also an option that districts would not be allowed to spend more over what was part of a foundation. If it was a meaningful, equitable foundation formula that also included, position-based grants, was very well weighted and included additional grants for all the things needed.
Mhm.
So that it could be structured in a way that's significantly different than the old one. It's what almost every other state in the country does. Some with greater success, some with less success. If it was a data-driven number, the legislature would be much less likely to whittle it away every year.
That's
Right.
what Picus does. That's what the other lawsuits, it's what is adequate. What is the number that the state has to provide to do what, more than one state Supreme Court has said is an adequate.
Right, but we don't have adequacy, we have equity, so we have a different type of constitutional, I am a lawyer,
Yes.
so
Yes.
excuse me, forgive me. But the language in the Constitution
Mhm.
does matter, and I think the Brigham's decision doesn't say how you achieve it,
No, it
right?
doesn't.
But it does say that where you live, you cannot, access to resources should not be dependent on where you live.
Mhm.
You could argue that
Right.
that is the situation we
I
have
think
right
that's the
now.
situation we have right
Right,
now.
and so, but I get concerned when I envision a scenario that has, okay, this is how much you get, but community X has, even with a statewide grant list, the appetite for spending. We
Yes.
have seen it, right? It is
Yes.
different, community by community.
Can we wait one second?
Additional spending. Yeah. Or budgeting.
So yes, there are policy tools like that with caps. I share that same concern. It's probably my top concern in all of this work, and that's the exact situation we are in now,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
low
And
spenders
so
do it out
we
of
are already
choice.
like in a system where we have extremely low spenders where kids are not at all getting their needs met, and extremely high spenders that are raising,
Right.
taxes for everyone.
Right,
And those kids are benefiting, right?
I have schools that pass their budget on the first go round and schools that it took 4 go rounds, just one.
Mhm.
But I've got both extremes in my district. And what those schools can offer can vary. We came out of when we had a violin orchestra in one elementary school, and another elementary school further north couldn't offer a second math course, or we have wide disparity. It says essentially the same, but I think what we've been realizing for a while is that if your town is relatively more affluent and relatively more focused on, you need to get into Harvard in order to have a relatively good life, it's easier to raise that money there than if your town is really struggling to buy groceries.
And I've actually seen a remarkable amount of data and I want to see more because I think that needs to be rerun because my experience is that that's actually, it's not about the wealth of the community on whether or not they're voting to have higher taxes or higher spending. And that sort of shocks me.
Yeah.
It's something more cultural than that. So,
Mhm.
and part of it is like, I pay particular attention to it because my district is actually one of the poorest districts in the state. And we have unbelievably high per pupil spending. And I don't mean like I mean like weighted per pupil spending, unbelievably high. And so there is something like there's more nuance to it than sort of, I think, assumptions about that might make like logical sense to folks who see people's behaviors. I wonder if at our next meeting, what we could do, there's a lot of momentum towards something like a foundation. And so I wonder if it would be helpful at our next meeting to really dive into like, what are the policy tools that would need to be attached to that to actually have it work? So like, is it caps? Is it extra grants? Is it like what would it look like to try to do that in a way that did feel way more Brigham compliant than the last time we did
I
this?
think it would be helpful to have a conversation and understand that more.
yeah.
And what other
Yes.
states do.
And I think,
Yes.
for me, the challenge one challenge is Act 60 was supposed to be funding formula and quality standards. And we have, to get at your point, Anne, around, and all of ours, like if the resources that are spent should result in some form of quality.
Yeah.
And as a state, we have fallen short of defining it, monitoring it, and helping communities understand what they're getting for the budgets that they approve. And so any change that happens, I think we have to keep that front and center.
We have one of the lowest continuation rates, one of the highest high school graduation, but one of the lowest continuation rates of other states.
Yes.
So
What's that?
why,
right.
what
Yeah.
is that? Because, I mean, if you're gonna put food on the table, you need something beyond high school anymore,
Yes.
in most cases.
One of the things that I feel really hopeful about the work that we've done as a group so far is that we have been so consistently clear on both sides of this table, right? And that it needs to be about improving the quality and effectiveness of the system. And there are tax levers that need to be there to reinforce that. But that they need to all happen as a package.
I appreciate the way you laid this out. Very helpful.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm glad. Okay, so the one part that we have skipped is the excess spending threshold tailoring. I'm sorry. We will get back to that at some point. We have 3 minutes left in our meeting. I heard us talking about going deep on sort of Brigham Foundation formula, policy tools, grants at our next meeting. Are there other pieces that folks would want to cover at our next meetings or future agendas? We have
Scheduled.
yeah, it's in 2 weeks.
I believe
Right?
it's
Yes.
next Monday.
Is it next
It's
Monday?
next Monday, virtual.
How delightful. I can't wait to see you all again. It
Which will
is
be
next
good.
Monday. the
I do think
25th.
looking at the
Yeah.
excess spending penalty, like whatever
Mhm.
we haven't gotten through, we should make our way through.
Okay.
I think if you want to group source some sort of, I'd love to be able to send to Megan, who's writing the
Yes.
report, God love her, something that is
Mhm.
digestible, or so I don't know if you could consolidate what we did, or if you want help with that, I'm happy to help, but
I'd be happy to help too.
some way to get it.
Yes, I promised her that we will get her this table in a good format.
consolidated format. Great. Well, if you need any assistance,
Yep.
happy to.
Same time next Monday?
Same time next Monday, but inside the computer, right?
Yes, it says virtual.
So
Okay,
next
good. I'll
Monday, I'll
be
probably
in
be
Pennsylvania.
sitting here. I thought it was remote until I tuned into the remote and saw in
Yeah.
Showed
person.
up and there were not people I recognized in this room.
Okay, so, and then we have received a memo about data from the Agency of Education. If we have time, we could review that, but I don't know if the full commission meeting is planning on reviewing that as well, so I'll check with Megan about that. Does that sound good?
Sure. I can there were 2 elements that tax was doing as well.
Mhm.
The 10-year ed fund uses and sources.
Mhm.
So I was reminded in Jake's presentation, he had the 10-year sources.
Yes.
So we just didn't have the uses.
Correct.
And Emma from Finance and Management is working on that.
Great.
And I think in my inbox is maybe a version of that we could talk. And I don't
Okay.
know to what degree we want to use it specifically, but we have it at our disposal.
Okay.
I think what is going at this point helpful is data that can be referenced in the report itself,
Yeah.
whether or not it's going to drive a decision or a vote on anything. It's just helpful
Yep.
to demonstrate we've been looking at some stuff.
I think the other thing.
Get some data to talk.
I think the other thing that's useful at this point is making sure that, so if the legislature starts discussing these things and then starts making data requests, the data won't be available in time to make decisions. And so to just even line up what data can be handed to the legislature to go along with these things, maybe not in the report, but like knowing that the request is out there and will be available by January will make a big difference too.
Yeah. I think
Um,
that is Megan's intent to
yes.
have, we have that whole.
Like a data
spreadsheet.
development agenda
Yeah,
of
just like
sorts,
these are
yes.
the things that are in process.
Will the special education report be ready by Monday? That's really soon. Let's say no.
I don't want to make
Okay, great.
guarantees
I
on
think we've got our
Monday.
hands.
Okay, I think we have our hands full.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else before we wrap?
I just want to take a peek at the agenda.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the great work.
Thank you.
We adjourned?
We're adjourned.
Great.
The most helpful meeting.
Good.
I mean, too.
Productive.
It was very helpful.
Oh, great.
Sit here and eat my lunch before.